Hear all these stories anywhere you listen, but tonight, do yourself a favor and turn the lights down low. Get comfortable. Because everything in this collection happens in the one place you're supposed to be safe. In your bed, in the dark, right on the edge of sleep. Tonight we've got 8 stories sent in by listeners just like you. A night security guard who wasn't the only one making rounds. A girl who learned that sleep paralysis isn't always just sleep paralysis. A babysitter should have trusted her gut about the closet. A group of campers who found out some lakes don't like to be swum in after dark. A hotel guest who kept getting the same room, no matter how many times she asked to switch. A long-haul trucker who picked up a hitchhiker he probably shouldn't have. A woman whose new apartment came with an upstairs neighbor who never seemed to sleep. And a sleep study volunteer who signed up to get paid to nap and got a lot more than she bargained for. So get cozy, dim the lights, and let's read. My name's Marcus, and I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma. For about 4 years in my late 20s, I worked security at a regional hospital. The kind of place with maybe 300 beds, a level 2 trauma center, and hallways so long you could ride a bike down them if anybody ever tried. I want to say up front that I loved that job. Most nights, security work at a hospital is about as exciting as watching paint dry. You walk your loop. You check your badges. You tell family members visiting hours are over. And you drink more bad coffee than any human being should be legally allowed to. But there was one wing, the old wing, that I never got used to. And there was one night in particular that I've never been able to shake. The hospital I worked at had been built in 3 phases. There was the shiny new tower where the trauma center and the ICU and all the good equipment lived. There was a 1980s addition that housed most of the regular patient floors. And then there was the original 1950s building, which by the time I worked there had been mostly converted into administrative offices, records storage, and a handful of overflow rooms that only got used when the rest of the hospital was completely full. We called it the old wing, and everybody who worked nights had their own stories about it. Cold spots, doors that wouldn't stay shut, a payphone on the 3rd floor that nobody had used in a decade, but that would sometimes ring anyway. For the first 2 years I worked there, I chalked all of it up to the kind of nonsense that builds up around any old building where people have died. And people have died in that building, a lot of them. Because it used to be the only hospital in the county, and it had seen everything from the flu epidemic of 1918's aftermath in local memory to farm accidents to childbirth gone wrong in an era before modern obstetrics. Old buildings like that accumulate stories the way a coat accumulates lint. I didn't put much stock in any of it. I was ex-military, I'd done 2 tours, and I liked to think that I'd seen enough real horror in my life that I didn't need to go inventing fake horror in an empty hallway. That changed on a Tuesday night in October, on what should have been the quietest shift of the month. It was slow, painfully slow. I'd done my 11 o'clock loop. Checked in with the 2 nurses covering the overflow floor in the old wing, who were both bored out of their minds and doing crossword puzzles. And then I'd settled into the little guard booth by the old wing's east entrance to do paperwork. Around 1 in the morning, my radio crackled with a call from the front desk. A motion sensor had tripped on the 3rd floor of the old wing near the records room. Now, this happened maybe once a month. Old building, old wiring, sometimes a draft would set off a sensor. Sometimes it was a stray cat that had gotten into the loading dock and wandered up a stairwell. 99 times out of 100 it was nothing. So I wasn't worried. I grabbed my flashlight because half the lights on that floor had been switched off to save on the electric bill, and I headed up. By then, the third floor of the old wing was mostly filing cabinets and cardboard boxes, records going back decades that hadn't been digitized yet, plus 2 or 3 patient rooms that were technically still functional but almost never used. My flashlight beam cut through the dark in that particular way that always made the hallway look longer than it actually was, throwing my own shadow out ahead of me like it wanted to get there first. I walked the length of the hall, checking doors, finding nothing. The motion sensor was mounted near room 314, an old patient room that had been unused as far as I knew for at least a year. I stood outside it and listened. Nothing. I tried the handle. Locked, like it should have been. I was about to radio the front desk and tell them it was a false alarm when I heard it. A voice from inside the room. Not loud, almost a whisper, but clear as anything in that silent hallway. It said, "There's someone there. Now I want you to understand. That room had been locked and dark, and according to the census sheet I'd checked not 20 minutes earlier, completely unoccupied." My first thought, the sensible thought, was that maybe a patient had wandered up from another floor, confused, maybe on medication that made them disoriented, and gotten themselves locked in somehow. That happens. Not often, but it happens. So I knocked and identified myself as security and asked if everything was okay in there. The voice answered again, and this time it sounded closer to the door, like whoever it was had walked right up to the other side of it. It said, "I don't know where I am. Can you help me? I think I fell asleep." That's a strange thing to say if you think about it. Not, "I'm lost," or "I need help," but specifically, "I think I fell asleep." I've turned that phrase over in my head more times than I can count in the years since. At the time, though, I just wanted to get whoever it was some help, so I used my master key to unlock the door. Empty. Let me be entirely clear about that, the room was empty. I swept my flashlight across every corner, checked the bathroom, checked behind the door, checked under the bed, which was bare, no sheets, no mattress even, just the frame. There was nobody in that room. But here's the thing that got under my skin and has stayed there ever since. The room was cold. Not hospital air conditioning cold. Genuinely, uncomfortably cold. The sort of cold where you can see your breath a little. And on the dusty windowsill. In the layer of dust that had clearly been undisturbed for a long time based on how evenly it was settled everywhere else in the room. There were 2 words traced with a fingertip. They said "Still Howie fast." I got out of that room. Radioed the front desk that it was a false alarm, because I genuinely did not know how to explain what had actually happened. And I did not go back up to the 3rd floor of the old wing alone for the rest of my time working there. I asked around later, carefully, trying not to sound like a crazy person, and I found out from one of the long-time maintenance guys that room 314 used to be a room where, back in the 60s and 70s, terminal patients were sometimes moved when there was nothing more the doctors could do for them and no other space available. He told me, very matter of fact, like it was just a piece of hospital trivia, that more than one nurse over the years had reported feeling like patients in that room would sometimes wake up confused right at the very end, not sure if they'd already died or were still alive, asking if anyone was there, asking for help finding their way. I finished out my contract at that hospital, and I never went looking for another explanation, because honestly, I'm not sure I wanted one. Some nights, when I think back on it, I wonder if whoever or whatever was in that room really was still confused about where they were. And some nights I wonder if maybe they weren't confused at all, and they just wanted somebody, anybody, to know they were still there. Either way, I never worked another night shift in a hospital again. I do IT support now. The building I work in was built in 2004, and as far as I know, absolutely nobody has ever died in it, and that suits me just fine. Hi, my name's Renata, I'm 24, and I go to school in Ohio, though I grew up in Texas. I want to preface this by saying that I know what sleep paralysis is. I've had it my whole life, on and off, usually during stressful periods, usually a handful of times a semester during finals. I know the science. Your brain wakes up before your body does. Your muscles are still locked in the atonia that keeps you from acting out your dreams, and your still dreaming brain, panicking about being unable to move, starts hallucinating a threat to explain the fear it's already feeling. Shadow figures, pressure on the chest, a sense of a presence in the room. It's a well-documented phenomenon, and it happens to something like 8% of people at some point in their lives. I know all of this. I've read the papers. I've talked to a sleep specialist about it. And none of that knowledge helped me even a little bit during sophomore year, when the episodes started getting worse, and started including someone I actually recognized. It started off totally typical. I'd wake up unable to move, feel a weight on my chest, sometimes see a shape standing in the doorway of my dorm room. And after 10 or 20 terrifying seconds it would pass, and I'd be able to move again, and I'd usually just lie there breathing hard until I fell back asleep. This had been happening on and off since high school, so even though it was awful in the moment, I wasn't scared of it in any lasting way. It was a known quantity, a predictable monster. That changed in February of my sophomore year. I'd been under a lot of stress. My grandmother had just passed away, and I hadn't been able to go home for the funeral because of a huge project deadline. And I think my sleep schedule had gotten fully wrecked from staying up late working and then crashing hard. The episodes started coming almost every night instead of once every few weeks, and they started getting specific. The first time it happened, I woke up paralyzed. Same as always, chest tight. That horrible pressing feeling like something heavy was sitting right on my sternum. I looked toward the door of my dorm room, which was standard for me. That was always where the shape appeared, if a shape was going to appear at all. And there was a shape there. But this time it wasn't a vague shadow person. This time I could see, with a clarity that still makes my skin crawl to think about, that it was my grandmother. Not scary movie zombie grandmother. My actual grandmother, exactly as she'd looked the last time I saw her alive, in her blue cardigan, standing very still, just watching me. Let me be fair to the science here, because I still believe the science. Grief hallucinations are extremely common. Something like half of people who lose a close family member report some form of sensory experience of that person afterward, hearing their voice, smelling their perfume, catching a glimpse of them in a crowd. Combine that with a documented history of sleep paralysis hallucinations and a brain that is exhausted and grieving and running on fumes. And of course my sleep paralysis was going to start drawing from that well. I told myself that, very firmly, every single morning after it happened. It didn't stop it from happening again. Over the next 3 weeks, it happened almost every night, and it was always her, and it always played out the same way. I'd wake up paralyzed, feel that crushing weight on my chest, and see her standing in the doorway. She never moved from the doorway. She never spoke. She just stood there watching, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, and then the paralysis would break, and she'd be gone. Here's the part that made me finally go see someone about it. Because up until this point I was managing. Sleeping badly, but managing. One night, close to the end of March, I woke up paralyzed as usual, saw her standing in the doorway as usual, and braced myself for the same 10 or 15 seconds I'd gotten used to. Except this time, she took a step into the room. Never in my life had I felt fear like that. Every single previous episode, the routine of it, awful as it was, had at least been predictable. This wasn't the routine anymore. She took one slow step forward, and then another, moving toward my bed with this terrible, unhurried certainty. And I was utterly unable to do anything but lie there and watch her come closer, unable to even scream. My heart absolutely hammering in my chest to the point where I truly thought I might be having a heart attack. She got to the foot of my bed, and she leaned down, close to my face, close enough that in the dim light from the hallway, I could see details I hadn't been able to see before. The exact pattern of the wrinkles around her eyes, a small mole on her cheek that I'd forgotten she had until that exact moment. And she said, very softly, in a voice that sounded exactly like her voice, "You didn't come say goodbye." And then the paralysis broke, and I sat bolt upright, and the room was empty. And I did not sleep again that night, or really properly, for about a week afterward. I went to my school's counseling center the next day and told them everything. They connected me with a sleep specialist. And for anyone listening who might be going through something similar, I'll say this plainly: this is a medical thing. It is treatable, and there is no shame in getting help for it. I started a course of treatment that included some changes to my sleep schedule, cognitive behavioral techniques for managing the panic that comes with the episodes, and eventually a low dose of medication that regulates the sleep-wake transition. The episodes became less frequent almost immediately, and within a couple of months, they'd mostly stopped. Not once did I see her again after that night. I don't know what to make of that, honestly. I don't know if it was grief or exhaustion or something else that I don't have the language or the worldview to properly explain. All I know is that a week after that last episode, I finally made the drive home on a weekend, 6 hours each way, and went to the cemetery and sat by her grave for a long time and said everything I hadn't gotten the chance to say at the funeral I missed. I don't know if that's why the visits stopped. I don't really want to know. Some questions, I've decided, are better left where they are. So I've been babysitting since I was about 14. And I'm 22 now, so that's 8 years of watching other people's kids for extra cash. And in that time I've had exactly one family give me a rule that I thought was weird enough to ask about. And exactly one night where I understood, entirely and permanently, why that rule existed. The family was the Hendersons, and I want to say up front that they were lovely people. Mr. Henderson worked in insurance. Mrs. Henderson did something with real estate, and they had 2 kids, a 7-year-old named Cody and a 4-year-old named Mia. I'd been sitting for them for about 6 months, mostly weekend date nights, and it was an easy gig. The kids were well behaved, the house was nice, and they always paid on time, sometimes even a little extra, if I'd had to deal with a meltdown or a late pickup. The only unusual thing about the job, and it really was the only unusual thing, was a rule Mrs. Henderson gave me on my very first night sitting for them. Delivered in this tone that was almost apologetic, like she knew how strange it was going to sound. She said, "This is going to sound odd, but please don't let Maya sleep with her closet door open. It has to be shut all the way before you turn off her light. She'll probably ask you to leave it open a crack, Don't. I promise I'm not just being controlling. There's a reason. I'll explain some other time. Now, as a professional babysitter, I have heard some strange parenting rules in my time. No screens after 6. Only speak to the dog in French, because they're trying to raise it bilingual. I'm not making that up. A kid who was required to say a specific rhyme before eating any red, colored food because of a long story involving a bad allergic reaction and some resulting superstition. So, keep the closet door shut. Barely registered on my personal weirdness scale. I said sure, no problem, and for 6 months, that's exactly what I did. Every single time I put Mia to bed, I made sure that closet door was shut tight before I turned off the light. And yeah, she'd usually whine about it a little and ask for it to be cracked open, and I'd tell her, sorry kiddo, mom's rule. And she'd grumble and then fall asleep within about 10 minutes anyway. Kids are resilient like that. The night I'm going to tell you about was in November, a Saturday, and the Hendersons were out at some work function for Mr. Henderson's company that was supposed to run late. Nothing about the start of the evening was unusual. I got the kids fed, did the normal bedtime routine. Read Cody 2 chapters of whatever chapter book he was working through at the time, got Mia settled with her stuffed rabbit, and shut that closet door good and tight, the way I always did, checking twice, because I'd developed a bit an automatic habit around it by then. Around 10:30. After both kids had been asleep for a couple hours, and I was downstairs on the couch watching something on my phone, I heard a sound from upstairs. Not crying, not the usual kid can't sleep noises I was used to. It was a scraping sound, slow and rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged very slightly across a wood floor, over and over. I turned the TV volume down and listened, and it kept going, coming from the direction of Maya's room. I went upstairs, and everything looked normal from the hallway. Maya's door was cracked the way I'd left it, night light glowing softly inside. I pushed it open a little more and looked in, and Mia was fast asleep in her bed, exactly where I'd left her, breathing slow and even. But the closet door, which I had absolutely shut, was open. Not fully open, maybe 6 or 8 inches, just enough to show a slice of darkness inside. And as I stood there in the doorway, I watched that door move, slowly, closing, then opening again, just a couple of inches each way, at the same steady rhythm as the scraping sound I'd heard from downstairs, which I now realized was the sound of the door itself, dragging very slightly against the carpet each time it swung. I'd like to say I had some rational explanation ready, a draft from a window, an uneven floor, something. And honestly, in the moment, that's exactly what I told myself, because the alternative was not something I was prepared to think about at 10:30 at night while responsible for 2 sleeping children. I walked over, feeling more nervous than I probably should have admitted even to myself, and I pushed the closet door shut, and I held the handle for a second, feeling almost foolish before letting go. It stayed shut. I told myself that settled it. Drafts don't have that somewhat predictable rhythm, but closets settle and houses shift, and I was probably imagining the rhythm part. I went back downstairs. About 20 minutes later, I heard it again. The same slow scraping. I went back up, and the door was open the same 6 or 8 inches, swinging the same slight arc. This time, though, Mia wasn't asleep. She was sitting up in bed, wide awake, staring directly at the gap in the closet door with an expression on her face that I can only describe as patient. Not scared. Patient, the way you'd look at a kettle you're waiting to boil. Confused, I asked her if she was okay, and she looked at me and said, in this very matter of fact 7-year-old going on 40 voice, You have to shut it all the way or he gets confused about which room he's in." "Who's he?" I asked, and she said, "I don't know his name. He used to live here. He's looking for his room, but this isn't it anymore. So if the door's open, he tries to come out and finds Maya's toys instead of his toys, and he gets sad. And then, like this was a totally unremarkable thing to say, she lay back down and closed her eyes. For a third time, I shut that closet door. And this time, I actually got the desk chair from her little study corner and wedged it under the handle. And I sat outside her room in the hallway with the door propped open until the Hendersons got home just after midnight. At which point I told Mrs. Henderson, in what I'm sure was a somewhat unhinged rush of words, exactly what had happened. She went pale, sat me down, and finally told me the story behind the rule. The house had been built in the 70s, and before the Hendersons bought it. It had belonged to an elderly man who'd lived there alone for the last 15 years of his life, and who had passed away in that exact room, which had been his bedroom, sitting in a chair he apparently kept positioned right where Maya's closet now stood, because his actual bed had been moved to the living room in his final months for easier access to the bathroom. He'd died alone and hadn't been found for almost 4 days. Mrs. Henderson had heard the story from a neighbor after they moved in and had dismissed it until Mia, then barely 3 years old and with no way of knowing any of this, started talking about the man in the closet who sits in his chair, and became distressed whenever the closet door was left open at night. They'd tried moving Maya to a different room. The behavior followed her. Eventually, closing the closet door became the fix that worked, so they just did it. No questions asked, and had done it faithfully for years. I still babysit for the Hendersons sometimes, though Maya's older now and doesn't need a sitter as much. The closet rule is still in effect, and I still, every single time, check that door twice. Me and 3 friends from college, Priya, Dev, and Kelsey, went camping over Labor Day weekend our junior year at a place we're going to call Loon Lake. Because that's not actually its name, and after what happened, I'd rather not draw a bunch of curious internet strangers out to the real one. It's a small, fairly remote lake in the upper Midwest, the sort of place with exactly 1 boat launch, a scattering of primitive campsites, and cell service that comes and goes depending on which way the wind is blowing. Or at least that's the story we always told ourselves for why our phones kept cutting out that weekend. We'd been going to this lake since freshman year. It was sort of our tradition. Load up Dev's truck with tents and a cooler and drive the 3 hours up from campus for one last blowout before the semester really got going. Nothing about the first 2 days was unusual. We swam, we grilled, we played cards by the fire, the normal stuff. It was the 3rd night, our last night before heading back, that things went sideways, around midnight. After the fire had burned down to coals and everybody had crawled into their respective tents, I woke up needing to pee. Which, if you've ever been camping, you know, is just an occupational hazard of drinking 3 seltzers by a campfire. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could so as not to wake Kelsey, who I was sharing with, and stepped out into the dark. The moon was close to full that night, so I could actually see fairly well without a flashlight. The whole campsite bathed in this flat silver light. And that's when I noticed that Dev wasn't in his tent. His tent flap was open, and through the mesh I could see his sleeping bag was empty. I figured he'd probably had the same idea I did about a bathroom trip, so I didn't think much of it at first. I did my business a good distance from camp, the way you're supposed to, and headed back. That's when I saw him. Dev was standing at the edge of the water, right where the tree line broke onto the little strip of sand we'd been using as a beach all weekend. He was just standing there, fully still, facing out toward the lake. And even from where I was, maybe 40 feet away, I could tell something was off about how he was standing. His arms were hanging at his sides in this loose, unnatural way, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening to something. I called his name, quietly at first, because I didn't want to freak out the whole camp over what was probably nothing, and he didn't respond. I called again, louder, and he still didn't turn around, didn't move at all except that his head tilted a little further, like whatever he was listening to had gotten more interesting. I started walking toward him, faster now, my heart picking up in a way that felt disproportionate to what was actually happening, which as far as I could tell was just my friend standing near some water in the middle of the night. When I got close enough to actually touch his shoulder, I realized his eyes were open, but they had this glassy, unfocused quality, like he was looking at something 1,000 yards past the actual lake in front of him, and he was talking. Very quietly, almost under his breath, in this flat monotone utterly unlike his normal voice. I leaned in to hear what he was saying, and it took me a second to make out the words, because they weren't words exactly, more like a rhythm, the same 3 or 4 syllables over and over. Not in English, not in any language I recognized. I shook his shoulder hard and called his name right in his ear, and he came back to himself all at once, flinching so violently that he nearly fell over, and grabbing onto my arm with a grip so tight it left marks. He looked around, entirely disoriented, and asked me what was going on, why we were at the beach, what time it was. He had absolutely no memory of leaving his tent, walking down to the water, or any of the several minutes I'd watched him standing there. He was shaking, really scared, and kept asking me over and over if I was sure he hadn't said anything unusual, because apparently, he said, he'd had a dream right before I woke him up, or right before whatever happened, of standing at the edge of dark water while something underneath it spoke to him in a language he somehow understood in the dream, but couldn't now remember a single word of. We got him back to camp, got him some water, and he was too shaken to want to talk about it much more that night. We all slept in one tent for the rest of the night, or tried to. In the morning, Dev seemed mostly back to normal. Chalked it up to some kind of intense sleepwalking episode brought on by too much sun and too little sleep over the weekend. And honestly, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it's the one we all quietly agreed to believe, at least out loud. Here's the part that none of us have ever been able to explain away quite as easily, though. When we were breaking down camp that morning, Priya, who'd gone down to rinse out the coffee pot at the water's edge, called the rest of us over. Right at the spot where I'd found Dev standing the night before. In the wet sand at the very edge of the lake, there were footprints. 2 sets. One matched Dev's sneakers, which made sense. He'd been standing right there. The other set was smaller, narrower, with what looked like unusually long toes, and they came up out of the water. Stopped about 3 feet from where Dev's prints were, and then went back into the water. There were no prints leading away from the water, anywhere else along the shoreline in either direction, and we checked, walking a good 1/4 mile each way. Whatever had made those prints had come out of the lake, stood close to my sleepwalking friend for however long. He'd been standing there, and gone back into the lake, and there was no earthly explanation any of the 4 of us could come up with for how that was possible. We haven't been back to that lake since, and Dev, who used to be the one always pushing for one more camping trip before the semester got busy, has quietly stopped bringing it up as an option at all. None of us really talk about that night anymore. But I know because he told me once, very late, very drunk, almost a year later, that he still sometimes dreams about that rhythm, those 3 or 4 syllables, and that in the dream, he always understands exactly what they mean, and he always wakes up before he can bring the meaning back with him. And some part of him is grateful for that, and some part of him wishes, just once, that he wouldn't wake up in time. My name's Dana. I'm from Ohio originally, but I travel a lot for work. I do quality auditing for a chain of manufacturing plants, which means I spend somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 nights a year in hotel rooms. I say all that so you understand that I am about as seasoned a hotel guest as you're likely to find, and that I do not startle easily at creaky pipes or unfamiliar noises, because I have heard every creaky pipe and unfamiliar noise a hotel has to offer over about 12 years of business travel. What happened to me at a mid-range chain hotel outside of Louisville 2 years ago is still, to this day, the only hotel experience that has ever actually frightened me, and it's the reason I now always, without exception, ask for a room above the 4th floor, no matter how much of an inconvenience that is for the front desk. I checked in on a Tuesday evening after a long drive, tired in that specific bone deep way you get after a full day of plant walkthroughs and a 4-hour drive on top of it. The front desk clerk, a young guy, very friendly, handed me a key card and told me I was in room 313. Nothing about that struck me as odd in the moment. I went up, got settled, ordered some room service, and went to bed early because I had a 6 a.m. plant tour the next morning. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up all at once, and I want to describe this as precisely as I can because it's important. I didn't wake up gradually the way you usually do. I woke up all at once, totally alert, like someone had flipped a switch, and the first thing I registered was that the room felt cold, colder than the air conditioning should have made it. The second thing I registered was a smell, faint but distinct, like old cigarette smoke. Even though the hotel was a strictly non-smoking property, and I could see the little placard on the desk confirming as much. The third thing I registered, and this is the part that made my whole body go rigid, was that there was a shape sitting in the armchair by the window. A person-shaped shadow, just sitting there, not moving, facing toward the bed. What most people would probably do, I dared lie fully still and tell myself it was a trick of the light. A coat I'd left on the chair, some combination of shadows from the parking lot lights outside filtering through the curtains. I made myself look again, more carefully. The shape was still there, and as my eyes adjusted further to the dark, I became convinced, with a certainty I still can't fully rationalize, that it was watching me. Fumbling, I reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. The chair was empty, obviously. There was nothing there, no coat. Nothing that could have been mistaken for a seated figure, even by the most overactive imagination. I sat there with the lamp on for a long time, feeling foolish and shaken in about equal measure, and eventually I convinced myself I'd been half dreaming. That weird liminal state between sleep and waking where your brain hasn't fully sorted out what's real yet. I left the lamp on and eventually fell back asleep. The next night, same room, obviously, since I was staying 3 nights for the audit. I woke up again in that same abrupt, switch-flipped way, and the chair was occupied again. This time I didn't reach for the lamp right away. I lay there, heart pounding, and made myself really look. Even now, Even with 2 years of distance and a healthy amount of self-skepticism, I'll tell you plainly that what I saw in that chair had the distinct outline of a man, broad-shouldered, sitting with his hands resting on the arms of the chair, head slightly bowed, like he was tired, or thinking, or waiting for something. I turned the lamp on. Empty chair, same as before. By the third night, I'll admit I was thoroughly rattled. But I also had an audit to finish and a very tight schedule, so switching rooms felt like an overreaction I wasn't quite ready to justify to myself, let alone to a front desk clerk. I did something different though. Instead of turning the lamp on right away when I woke up and the shape was there, I forced myself to speak in a shaky voice into the dark. I said, "There's somebody there." The shape didn't move, didn't respond in any way I could perceive. But the temperature in the room, which had already felt cold, seemed to drop further, enough that I could see my own breath faintly in the light coming through the curtain gap. And then, very softly, I heard something that I have never been able to explain and have mostly stopped trying to. A voice, low male, tired sounding, said a single word. Finally, so fast that I nearly knocked it off the nightstand. I switched the lamp on. Empty chair. I did not go back to sleep that night. I sat up with every light in the room on, checked out at 5 a.m. rather than waiting for my 6 a.m. alarm, and drove straight to the plant. Badly underslept but very ready to be anywhere other than that hotel. Carefully, I mentioned what had happened to the same front desk clerk when I checked out for good a few days later, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, his expression went a little strange, and he told me, in a lowered voice, that room 313 had a bit of a reputation among the staff, though management didn't like them talking about it. A guest had died in that room a number of years back, a heart attack alone, and hadn't been found for the better part of a day because he'd put the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door, and nobody had thought anything of it. The clerk told me some of the housekeeping staff refused to service that room alone, always going in pairs, and that at least 2 other guests over the years had complained, independently and without knowing about each other's experiences, of a man sitting in the chair by the window. I still travel constantly for work, and I still stay in that same hotel chain fairly often because of a corporate rate agreement. But now, every single time, without fail, I call ahead or ask at the desk specifically to not be placed in room 313, and I've made it a broader personal policy to ask for rooms on higher floors generally. On the theory, which I know isn't really logical, but which makes me feel better anyway, that whatever's happening in low rooms close to a hotel's original construction footprint is somehow less likely to happen 8 or 10 floors up in a newer wing. I've never had another experience like it since. I also, and I recognize how this sounds, still think about that word sometimes, late at night, in hotel rooms that are absolutely, utterly empty except for me. Finally, I've been driving long haul for almost 20 years now. Mostly runs between Texas and the upper Midwest, sometimes out to the coast if the money's right. If you've never done long haul trucking, I'll tell you the thing nobody warns you about when you get into it isn't the traffic or the weather or the hours, though those are all real challenges. It's the fighting your own brain part. Somewhere around hour 10 or 11 of a drive, especially at night, your mind starts doing things. Highway hypnosis, they call it. That state where you're technically awake and technically driving fine, but some part of your brain has checked out, and time starts moving in these weird lurches, where you'll realize you don't actually remember the last 20 miles. Let me tell you about a run I made about 8 years back, hauling a refrigerated load up from San Antonio to Minneapolis. Driving through the night because the delivery window was tight and I needed to make up time I'd lost to a bad tire earlier in the trip. Roughly 2 in the morning, deep into rural Kansas, on a stretch of highway so empty, I hadn't seen another vehicle's headlights in probably 40 minutes. I saw a figure standing on the shoulder up ahead, illuminated by my own headlights, thumb out. Now, picking up hitchhikers is something you're trained not to do. Full stop, for a whole host of good reasons, and in 20 years of driving I had never once done it. No matter how bad the weather or how sympathetic the situation looked. But there was something about hour 11 of driving, and the particular loneliness of that stretch of Kansas highway at 2 in the morning. That made me pull over before I'd really consciously decided to. I told myself it was because there wasn't a town or even a gas station for probably 30 miles in either direction. And leaving somebody out there in the cold felt actually dangerous. That's what I told myself anyway. The guy who climbed up into the cab was maybe mid-30s, wearing a jacket that was too light for how cold it actually was that night, and he thanked me quietly and said he was headed towards Salina, which was more or less on my route, so that worked out fine. He didn't talk much at first, which honestly suited me fine, since conversation wasn't really what I was after, just some company to help keep me alert for the next stretch. At around mile marker, I don't remember exactly, he started talking, and it was the a bit talking that happens sometimes late at night, with a stranger you're never going to see again, where people say things they wouldn't say in the daylight to somebody they actually know. He told me he'd been having trouble sleeping for months. Ever since, he said, he started dreaming about a specific stretch of road, this exact stretch of road, actually. Though he'd never been out this way before as far as he could remember. He said in the dream he was always walking along the shoulder, always at night, always cold, and there was always a truck that would eventually stop for him, and every single time, right as he climbed into the cab, he'd wake up in his actual bed, heart pounding, and it had happened so many times, night after night for months, that he'd finally decided to just drive out here himself and see if the road even existed the way he'd dreamed it, because part of him had started to wonder if he was losing his mind. Laughing a little nervously, I told him that was one of the strangest stories I'd heard in a while, and asking him what he thought would happen if the dream ever finished playing out. If the truck ever actually took him somewhere, instead of the dream ending right as he got in. He got very quiet for a while after that, long enough that I glanced over to make sure he was okay. And he was just looking straight ahead through the windshield, with this expression I can only describe as deeply unsettled, like the question had truly scared him in a way my joke hadn't intended. Finally he said, very quietly, "I don't know. But I don't think I'm supposed to find out." We drove in silence for a good while after that, and I'll admit the atmosphere in the cab had shifted into something I didn't love. That particular somewhat tension, where you badly want to fill the silence with something normal, but can't quite think what. About 20 minutes before I would have needed to peel off towards Salina to drop him where he'd asked, he spoke again and asked me, in a voice that had gone strange and flat, whether I ever dreamed about my route. I said sure, sometimes. Everybody dreams about whatever they spend their days doing. He asked if I'd ever dreamed about this exact stretch of highway, specifically by name. And I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature, that I actually had, more than once over the years, always the same dream. of driving this same stretch at night and picking up a hitchhiker on the shoulder, and something about the specificity of that coincidence, combined with the strangeness of the whole conversation, made every hair on my arms stand straight up. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked him what happened in his dream after he got in the truck, since he'd already told me it always ended right there. He said, "It doesn't end." I lied. "I just don't want to tell you the rest." And then he asked me to pull over, right there, miles before the Salina exit we'd agreed on. In the middle of nowhere with nothing around but dark fields in every direction. I did pull over, because at that point I very much wanted him out of my cab. And he thanked me again, that same quiet, polite thank you from when he'd first climbed in and got out and shut the door. And I watched him in my mirrors as I pulled back onto the highway, standing exactly where I'd left him, on the shoulder, in the cold, watching my taillights disappear. I made my delivery in Minneapolis without further incident, and I told myself, over the following weeks, that it had just been an odd, tired, 2 a.m. conversation with a strange man, nothing more. The sort of thing that happens sometimes on long hauls when your brain is fried, and a stranger's brain happens to be equally fried in some complementary way. But I have never, in the 8 years since, picked up another hitchhiker on that stretch of highway or anywhere else, no matter the weather, no matter how empty the road, no matter how much that particular sort of hour, 11 loneliness tries to talk me into it. And I have never again let myself finish that particular dream of my own, the one where I pick somebody up on that shoulder, because now, every single time it starts, I wake myself up on purpose before I have to find out what happens next. I moved into a new apartment about 3 years ago, a decent one, bedroom in an older building, exposed brick, high ceilings. They're the type of unit that looks great on a rental listing photo and only reveals its actual quirks after you've signed a year-long lease. One of those quirks, which I discovered almost immediately, was that I could hear my upstairs neighbor walking around at pretty much any hour of the day or night. Old buildings have thin floors, that's just a fact of life, and I'd braced myself for some noise when I moved in. What I hadn't braced myself for was the sheer consistency of it. My upstairs neighbor, whoever they were, walked constantly, slow, steady, back and forth footsteps at 2 in the afternoon, at midnight, at 4 in the morning. I never heard a TV up there, never heard music, never heard voices. Just footsteps at all hours, like someone pacing a room they could never leave. For the first few months, it was annoying in the entirely mundane way that noisy neighbors are annoying, and I mostly just invested in a white noise machine and adjusted. I actually never saw my upstairs neighbor in the building's shared spaces, not once in all that time, which struck me as a little odd, given how much they were apparently home. But buildings like mine had enough units and enough staggered schedules that it wasn't impossible to just never cross paths with someone for months at a stretch. The thing that changed my whole relationship with those footsteps happened on a night in early winter, around 1 in the morning, when I woke up to the pacing directly above my bedroom, which wasn't unusual in itself, except that this time the footsteps stopped right above my bed and stayed stopped for a long time, 10 minutes, 15, just silence where there'd been steady pacing moments before. And then, very faintly, I heard something else, a voice muffled by the floor between us, but audible enough that I could tell it was a woman, and that she was speaking in this low, urgent, repetitive way, like she was pleading with somebody or reciting something over and over. I couldn't make out any actual words, just the rhythm and the tone, which had this quality of real distress that made me sit up in bed and just listen, uneasy in a way I couldn't quite justify to myself. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Most nights, ordinary pacing, nothing remarkable. But every so often, maybe once a week, the pacing would stop abruptly, always right above my bedroom, and the muffled, urgent voice would start. Always going on for 10 or 15 minutes before the pacing resumed as if nothing had happened. I started to really worry that whoever lived up there was in some a bit distress, maybe a mental health crisis, maybe something worse. And I debated for a long time whether to say something to the building manager, or by leaving a note, or just by finally, deliberately, trying to run into this person in the hallway or the elevator to check in as a concerned neighbor. Finally, I worked up the nerve to ask the building's superintendent about it. A guy named Ray who worked in the building for something like 15 years and knew basically everyone and everything about the place. I described the pacing, the timing, the muffled, distressed voice, and asked if he knew anything about who lived up there and whether they might need a wellness check. Ray got a strange look on his face and told me that unit had actually been vacant for almost 2 years, ever since the previous tenant, an elderly woman, had passed away in her sleep. Nobody had moved in since, he said, because the estate handling her affairs was tied up in some somewhat legal dispute among relatives, and the unit had just been sitting empty, technically off the market, the whole time. I'd love to tell you I laughed this off and assumed Ray was messing with me, or mistaken. Or that maybe there was some other unit I was actually hearing through some quirk of the building's layout. I did try to convince myself of all of those things, in fact, over the following days. But that same week, the pacing started again around midnight, directly overhead, the same as always, and I lay there. Now knowing what I knew, feeling a sort of dread I hadn't let myself feel before. And about 20 minutes in, right on schedule, the pacing stopped. Right above my bed, and the muffled voice started, low and urgent and repetitive, going on and on in that language I couldn't quite pass through the floor. This time, instead of just lying there, I got up, moved to directly beneath, where the sound seemed to be coming from, and pressed my ear as close to the ceiling as I could manage while standing on my bed, feeling ridiculous and terrified in about equal measure. And for one brief stretch, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, the muffled quality briefly cleared. The way a radio sometimes catches a station clearly for just a moment before drifting back into static. And I heard, with perfect clarity, a woman's voice say, "Please just let me go home. I want to go home. I moved out of that apartment 4 months before my lease was actually up." Eating the penalty fee without complaint, because it felt like a small price for never having to hear that sentence again in the dark. I never did find out anything more about the previous tenant, whether she died peacefully or in some sort of distress, whether home meant that apartment or somewhere else entirely that she'd been trying endlessly to find her way back to. I think about her sometimes, though, still pacing up there as far as I know, night after night, in an apartment that Ray told me the last time I ran into him downtown a year or so later was still empty, still tied up in that same unresolved legal dispute, still sitting there waiting, I suppose, for whatever it is she's actually looking for. In my last year of grad school, broke in the way that only grad students and people in their early 20s can really be broke, I signed up for a paid sleep study through the university's psychology department, run out of a small lab that studied disordered sleep patterns, insomnia, that sort of thing. The pay was decent for a few nights' commitment, and I figured, worst case, I'd get a few nights of monitored, comfortable sleep in a private room and a check at the end of it. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, because even now, having gone back over it 100 times, I still can't fully account for one particular night. The study protocol was fairly standard, as far as I understood it. I'd show up in the evening, get wired up with a bunch of electrodes on my scalp and chest to monitor brain activity and heart rate, sleep in a small private room that had a one-way observation window and a camera in the corner, and a researcher would monitor everything from an adjoining control room overnight. I was told I was Subject 14, which the coordinator explained was just their internal numbering system for that particular study cohort. Nothing more sinister than that, though even at the time it struck me as something out of a much creepier story than the one I actually expected to be living. Both of the first 2 nights were totally unremarkable. I slept reasonably well, given the electrodes and the unfamiliar room. And in the mornings the researchers would ask me a standard set of questions about how I'd slept, whether I remembered any dreams, that sort of thing. Nothing about either of those nights struck me as strange in any way. The third night was different from the moment I lay down. I felt unusually tired that night, more tired than the mild sleep deprivation of the study protocol should have accounted for, and I fell asleep faster than I had either of the previous nights. What happened after that, I only partially remember, and the fragments that stayed with me. I've never been able to fully square with what the researchers told me the following morning. At some point during the night, I became aware that I was dreaming. In that lucid way where you know you're dreaming, but can't quite pull yourself out of it. In the dream, I was still in the same small observation room, lying on the same narrow bed, except the room felt subtly wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The proportions slightly off, the lighting a shade too green. Toward the observation window, the one-way mirror that separated my room from the control room, where the researchers were supposedly monitoring me, I looked and saw, instead of my own dim reflection, which is what that window normally showed from my side, a face pressed close to the glass, looking in at me. Not a researcher's face. Nobody I recognized at all, just a pale, still face, watching unmoving, for what felt like a very long time in the dream. In the dream, I tried to call out, and found that I couldn't make any sound come out. The same helpless paralysis feeling that I understand now is extremely common in dreams that occur during or near REM sleep. The face on the other side of the glass, very slowly, raised one hand and pressed it flat against the window, fingers spread, and a feeling of absolute, bone-deep wrongness washed over me. The kind of dream, fear that's somehow worse than any waking fear, because your body reacts to it with the same physiological terror as something real, even though some small part of your dreaming mind knows, or half knows, that it isn't. Gasping, I woke up, according to my own memory anyway, sometime in what felt like the middle of the night. Though I had no real way to judge the actual time from inside that windowless little room. And here is the part that I have never been able to explain to my own satisfaction. When the researchers reviewed my data the following morning, they told me, with a level of clinical detachment that I found almost more unsettling than the dream itself, that my monitoring equipment had recorded a brief but very unusual event partway through the night. For a period of just under 4 minutes, they said, every single sensor I was wired to, brain activity, heart rate, everything, had gone fully flat, reading exactly as it would for someone who was awake and calm. Not asleep, not dreaming, just flatly, boringly awake and then, just as abruptly, had resumed showing normal sleep stage patterns, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. They had no explanation for it. Equipment malfunction was their leading theory, though they admitted, a little sheepishly, that they'd never seen quite that specific pattern of anomaly before, all sensors simultaneously and briefly reading as if the subject, meaning me, had simply not been asleep at all during that window, despite every indication before and after that I very much had been. As casually as I could manage, while my stomach was doing something complicated, I asked whether the observation window on my room was one way in both directions, or whether it was possible, even briefly, for someone standing in the control room to see clearly into my room while I could only see my own reflection. The lead researcher told me, a little puzzled by the question, that of course it was strictly one way. That was the entire point of the design, and that nobody, under any circumstances, would have been standing directly at that glass anyway. Since the control room was set up with monitoring stations a good 6 or 8 feet back from the window itself, I completed the study, collected my payment, and have never signed up for another one since, sleep-related or otherwise. I don't know what actually happened during those 4 minutes, and I've honestly tried, over the years, to find some rational explanation that fully satisfies me. Sensor malfunction, an unusually vivid and coincidentally timed dream. Some combination of the two. Most of the time, in daylight, those explanations feel like enough. But every so often, late at night, in an unfamiliar room, I'll catch myself glancing at a dark window, and for just a half second before I can stop it, some part of my brain expects to see a pale, still face on the other side of the glass, hand pressed flat against it, patiently waiting for me to notice it's there. I worked as a home health aide for close to a decade before switching careers, and for most of that time I specialized in overnight care, sitting with elderly or terminally ill patients through the night, so their families could get some actual sleep. It's a strange the sort of work if you've never done it. You spend hours in someone else's quiet house, in someone else's quiet grief, watching a person breathe. Sometimes doing very little else for hours at a stretch, except being present in case something changes. Most nights were uneventful in the medical sense, which is exactly what you want in that line of work. But there was one family, the O'Caffers, and one patient, their grandmother, Adays, whose final weeks I sat through, that I still think about more than any other case from that entire decade. Adays was in her late 80s, in home hospice care for advanced heart failure, and by the time I was brought on, she was mostly sleeping through the days and nights both, waking for brief, lucid stretches that grew shorter and further apart as the weeks went on. Her family was warm and attentive, always leaving me detailed notes about her routine, her medications, what soothed her when she grew agitated. Nothing about the situation was unusual for hospice work, which, grim as it sounds, has its own steady, manageable rhythm once you've done it a while. About 2 weeks into my time with the family, I started noticing something odd during my overnight shifts. Adays, who by that point rarely spoke more than a few words even during her waking moments, would sometimes, deep in the night, start speaking clearly and at length in her sleep, in a language I didn't recognize, which her daughter later confirmed was Igbo, her first language, one she'd mostly stopped using once her English became fluent decades earlier. That alone wasn't so strange. It's well documented that people with dementia or nearing the end of life often revert to a childhood or first language, even after decades of not using it. What was strange was the specific pattern of it. Every single night, Around 3 in the morning, without fail, Adaze would grow restless in her sleep and would begin speaking, always in Igbo, always in what her daughter, once I described it to her, identified as the cadence of someone having a conversation, pausing as though listening to a response before continuing. And every single night, this would go on for almost exactly 20 minutes, and then she would grow calm again and sleep peacefully until morning. Mostly out of professional diligence, I mentioned the pattern to her daughter, Ngozi. Since sudden changes in a hospice patient's nightly behavior are worth flagging, even when they don't seem medically alarming. Ngozi got very quiet when I described it, and then told me that her mother's younger sister, Adaze's sister, had died in a car accident back in Nigeria decades ago, at exactly 3 in the morning local time. A fact the family had always found strange given the time difference and the specific hour Ngozi's own mother would sometimes mention over the years as a time she felt watched over. Ngozi asked, very carefully, whether I could try to make out any of what her mother was saying, since she herself wasn't able to sit through every overnight shift. Over the following nights, I did my best, recording brief snippets on my phone with the family's permission, not to invade Adaze's privacy, but so Ngozi could listen and translate anything that seemed meaningful to her. Most of what Ngozi translated back to me was fragmentary, loving, ordinary things, the sort of conversation two sisters might have across a lifetime of separation. Questions about family, reassurances, the occasional shared laugh that would ripple faintly across Adaze's sleeping face in a way that, family superstition aside, was actually lovely to witness. The night Adaze passed away was, appropriately or not, one of my scheduled overnight shifts. It was a Tuesday, and everything through the evening had proceeded normally, her breathing a little more labored than usual, which the hospice nurse had warned the family might happen in the final days, but nothing that seemed like an immediate emergency. Around 2:40 in the morning, 20 minutes earlier than her usual pattern, Adaze grew restless and began speaking in Igbo, the same cadence as always, pausing to listen, responding. This quiet, intimate back and forth that I'd come to find almost comforting over my weeks with the family despite understanding none of the actual words. At almost exactly 3 in the morning, her usual time, she grew still and quiet, mid-sentence, in a way that was different from her usual pattern of calming gradually back into ordinary sleep. I checked her vitals immediately, the way I'd been trained to, and found no pulse. She had passed, peacefully as far as I could tell, sometime in that final minute or two. Right in the middle of whatever conversation she'd been having every single night for weeks with a sister who had, as far as any of us understood the actual facts of the world, died on another continent decades before. I called it in, followed protocol, woke the family. All the things you're trained to do. But I stood in that quiet room afterward, waiting for the family to gather themselves enough to come say goodbye, and feeling, with total clarity, that whatever conversation Adaze had been having every night at 3 in the morning had finally, at long last, reached wherever it had been heading the whole time, and that she hadn't gone anywhere alone. I don't know what to make of that feeling, professionally or personally, all these years later. I only know I've never felt anything quite like it, before or since. In any of the many other rooms I sat in during that decade of overnight work. When my husband Nathan and I bought our first house together, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet older neighborhood, we knew going in that it needed work. The inspection had flagged some outdated wiring, a roof that would need replacing within 5 years or so, and a basement that smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times we aired it out. None of that bothered us much. We were young, we were excited, and we figured we had years to slowly fix things up exactly the way we wanted. What we didn't know, and what took us almost 18 months of living there to fully understand, was that the house had a rhythm to it that had nothing to do with the plumbing or the electrical. It started small, the type of thing you barely register as unusual until you've noticed it enough times to realize it's actually a pattern. Nathan and I both work fairly standard schedules, up around 6:30, asleep most nights by around 11. Within our first few weeks in the house, I started noticing that I'd wake up, almost without fail, at exactly 2:17 in the morning. Not 2, not 2:15, not 2:20. 2:17. Checked against my phone often enough that I started to truly wonder if I was subconsciously watching the clock and waking myself up to match it. Some a bit self-fulfilling anxious habit. I didn't think much of it until, about 2 months in, Nathan mentioned, almost in passing over breakfast one morning, that he kept waking up at the same strange hour and had just assumed it was some quirk of his own sleep cycle, or maybe a neighbor's car alarm or a passing train he wasn't consciously registering. When we compared notes and realized we were both waking at exactly 2:17, night after night, independently of each other, without either of us stirring the other awake in the process, it started to feel like something worth paying closer attention to. Once we started actually watching for it, rather than just noticing it after the fact, the pattern got harder to write off as coincidence. Every single night, right around 2:17, the house would make a sound, a single low creak, seemingly from somewhere in the walls between our bedroom and the hallway, distinct from the ordinary settling sounds an old house makes throughout the night. It was always just the one creak, never more, always at that same time, give or take a minute or two. We did what any reasonably curious homeowners would do and started digging into the house's history, first through county records, and eventually by talking to a couple of long-time neighbors who'd lived on the street for decades. What we learned was that the house had originally been built in the 1930s and had changed hands several times over the decades. Nothing particularly dramatic in the official record. No reported deaths on the property. Nothing that would explain a specific recurring nightly event. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol, who'd lived 3 doors down since the 70s, told us something that stuck with us far more than anything in the county records. She said the family who'd lived in the house through most of the 60s and 70s, the Feldmans, had a son who worked the night shift at a factory across town for years, and that Carol distinctly remembered from her own younger years living nearby, that the son used to come home from his shift and let himself in through the side door at almost exactly the same time, night after night, because she used to hear his old truck pull into the driveway from her own bedroom window when she couldn't sleep. When we asked what time that was, she thought about it for a moment and said she couldn't be utterly sure after all these years. But she was fairly confident it was at around 2:15 in the morning. Neither Nathan nor I is particularly inclined towards supernatural explanations for things, and we spent a fair amount of energy over the following months trying to find some mundane cause for the creak, checking the attic for settling issues, having a contractor look at the foundation, even setting up a cheap camera pointed at the hallway to see if we could catch anything. The camera never caught so much as a shadow out of place. The creak kept happening, right on schedule, night after night, whether we were watching for it or not. Eventually, we stopped trying to explain it and just sort of accepted it as part of living in the house, the way you'd accept a squeaky stair or a door that always sticks in humid weather. We even started, half-jokingly, referring to it as the 217, as in, "Did you hear the 217 last night?" The same way you might refer to a passing train. It stopped feeling frightening somewhere in that first year, and started feeling, oddly, almost companionable, like the house had its own small, harmless habit that had nothing to do with us, and asked nothing of us beyond a bit of curiosity. We sold that house 4 years later, when Nathan's job moved us across the state, and I'll admit that on our very last night there, packing boxes stacked around us in an otherwise empty bedroom, we both stayed awake on purpose until 2:17 came and went, one final creak in the dark. And I remember feeling an unexpectedly strong pang of something like grief, saying goodbye to a house that had, in its own strange, quiet way, been keeping a kind of company with us the whole time we lived there. I sometimes wonder if the new owners have noticed it yet. Whether they've started calling it something of their own. Whether somewhere out there, right around 2:15 every single morning, that house is still marking the same old shift change. It's apparently been marking for the better part of a century. Let me tell you about the summer I worked as a counselor at a sleepaway camp, back when I was 19. Because it's the only job I've ever had where I actually asked to be reassigned mid-season, something I'm not proud of, but which I'd do again in a heartbeat given everything that happened. The camp, which I'll call Lakeview because that's close enough to the truth without being the actual name, was a fairly standard summer camp. Cabins full of kids aged 8 to 12, a lake for swimming and canoeing, a dining hall, the works. I was assigned to a cabin of 10-year-old boys for the first half of the summer, which was mostly what you'd expect. Exhausting but really fun. Bug bites and campfire songs, and refereeing arguments over whose turn it was to use the good flashlight. About 3 weeks into the season, one of the boys in my cabin, a quiet kid named Theo, who hadn't given me a moment of trouble the entire time, started having trouble sleeping. Not the ordinary homesickness, related trouble sleeping that's honestly pretty common the first week or two of camp. This started well after he'd otherwise settled in fine, and it had a specific shape to it that made the other counselors and I start comparing notes. Theo would wake up most nights, always around the same time, a little after 1 in the morning, and would sit up in his bunk, wide awake, and stare at the cabin's screen door, the one leading out toward the path down to the lake. He wouldn't cry, wouldn't call out for anyone, would just sit there, silent, watching that door, for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, before lying back down and apparently falling right back asleep. When the other counselors and I asked him about it during the day, gently, not wanting to make him feel singled out, he had no memory of it at all, and seemed honestly confused that we were asking, which itself was a little unsettling, since a couple of the other boys in the cabin had definitely noticed and had started, in the way 10-year-olds do, treating it as an exciting camp mystery rather than anything to actually worry about. Some nights, I started staying awake on purpose, just to keep an eye on things, telling myself I was being responsible, rather than admitting I was actually curious and a little spooked. On one of those nights, about a week after the pattern started, I was sitting up reading by flashlight when Theo woke, right on schedule, and sat up, and stared at that screen door the same as always. Except this time, I was awake enough to actually follow his gaze closely, and I noticed something I hadn't caught before. His eyes weren't fixed on the door itself. They were fixed on a spot just outside it, on the dark path beyond the screen, tracking very slowly, almost imperceptibly, left to right, as though watching something move along the tree line in the dark. As quietly as I could, I got up and went to the door myself, looking out at the same stretch of path, and saw absolutely nothing. Just the ordinary dark of a summer night at camp, crickets going, the faint glow of the lake reflecting what little moonlight there was. When I turned back, Theo had already lain back down, asleep again, right on his usual schedule. The next day I mentioned it carefully and as casually as I could manage to one of the senior counselors, a woman named Priscilla, who'd worked at that same camp for something like 9 summers and knew the place better than anybody. She got quiet in a way that made me nervous before she'd even said anything, and then told me that Theo's cabin, Cabin 7, had a reputation among longtime staff that new counselors generally weren't told about, on the theory that it would just make everyone unnecessarily jumpy over what was probably nothing. Years before I'd ever started working there, she said, a camper had gone missing overnight from that exact cabin, had apparently wandered out toward the lake in his sleep, and had drowned before anyone realized he was even gone. It had happened, she told me, at a little after 1 a.m, based on the best reconstruction anyone had ever been able to piece together. And the search had gone on for hours along that exact path before his body was eventually found. I asked her, my stomach doing something unpleasant, whether other kids in that cabin over the years had shown any similar behavior, and she admitted, reluctantly, that it wasn't the first time a camper assigned to Cabin 7 had developed some version of the same pattern partway through the summer. Always the same rough time, always fixed on that same door, always with no memory of it afterward. It didn't happen every summer, she said, and it didn't happen to every kid. But it happened often enough over the years that some of the long-time staff had their own private theories about it that they mostly kept to themselves so as not to alarm the parents or the newer counselors. I asked to be reassigned to a different cabin for the second half of the season, citing, honestly, that I just wasn't sleeping well in Cabin 7, which wasn't exactly a lie. The camp accommodated the request without much fuss. These things happen sometimes with counselor placements. Theo, as far as I know, finished out the rest of his summer without incident once I was no longer there to notice one way or the other. And I have no idea whether the pattern continued after I left or stopped on its own the way these things sometimes do. I never went back to that camp for a second season, and I've never told this story to anyone who worked there after me, mostly because I'm still not sure what good it would do, except maybe to make somebody else start watching that door the way I did. And I'm not sure that's a favor I want to do for anyone. My in-laws' house has a guest room that I have slept in exactly 4 times in the 11 years I've been with my husband, and every single time, without exception, I have woken up at some point in the night to find myself standing at the foot of the bed, facing the door, with absolutely no memory of getting up. I want to walk through this carefully, because it's the sort of thing that sounds almost silly said plainly. Sleepwalking happens. Plenty of people sleepwalk. There's nothing inherently supernatural about waking up somewhere other than where you fell asleep. What I can't explain, and what has kept me making excuses to avoid that room for over a decade now, is the specific and consistent detail of what happens right before I wake up standing there. The first time it happened was the very first Christmas I spent with my husband's family, back when we'd only been dating a few months and I was desperately eager to make a good impression, which meant, among other things, not mentioning to anybody that I'd apparently spent part of the night sleepwalking around their guest room. I woke up standing at the foot of the bed, facing the closed door, with the strong, specific, lingering impression that I had just been listening to something. The way you sometimes wake from a dream still half, hearing whatever sound was happening in it. I couldn't have told you, in that first moment, what the sound had actually been, only that it had been important enough that some part of me had gotten up out of bed to listen more closely to it. That first time, I chopped it up to an unfamiliar bed and general first time meeting the family nerves, and didn't think much more about it. The second time it happened was almost 2 years later, after we were engaged, staying in the same room over a different holiday. And the exact same thing happened, waking up standing at the foot of the bed facing the door, with that same lingering sense of having just been listening to something I couldn't quite place. That's when I started to feel like this was more than just an unfamiliar bed fluke, since by that point I'd slept in plenty of unfamiliar beds over the intervening 2 years without a single other episode of sleepwalking. By the third time, a couple years into our marriage, I'd started paying much closer attention to the specifics, trying to catch whatever detail my waking brain kept losing hold of in that first disoriented moment. That third time, I managed, for just a second or two before it slipped away entirely, to hold onto the tail end of what I'd apparently been dreaming or hearing. Right before I woke up standing there, it was a voice on the other side of the door, out in the hallway, a child's voice, very young, saying something I couldn't fully make out except for the last few words, which were, as best I could reconstruct them in that hazy half-second, "Come find me." After that third time, I finally told my husband about it, feeling a little foolish, expecting him to laugh it off gently, the way you'd expect a reasonable person to react to, "I keep sleepwalking to the door because I think I hear a kid in the hallway." Instead, he got quiet and told me something about that room I'd never known, because it wasn't the sort of thing that comes up in normal conversation. Before he was born, his parents had had another child, a daughter, who had died as a toddler, decades before I ever entered the picture, in what he understood to have been some kind of household accident that the family almost never discussed, out of what he assumed was simple grief rather than any specific secrecy. The guest room I kept sleeping in, he told me, hesitantly, had originally been that daughter's nursery, before his parents, unable to bear leaving it as it was, had converted it into a guest room not long after. The fourth and, so far, most recent time I stayed in that room was just this past year, and I'll admit I went into it braced, half expecting nothing to happen, given how much time had passed, and how thoroughly I'd rationalized the previous episodes as some combination of coincidence and suggestion once I knew the room's history. It happened anyway, same as always, waking up standing at the foot of the bed facing the door. But this time, for the first time, I managed to stay in that hazy, not quite awake state a little longer before it fully dissolved, and I heard, more clearly than any of the previous times, that same small voice, right outside the door, not fading this time, but saying, quite plainly, "You found me. I haven't slept in that room since, and I don't intend to again if I can help it," which admittedly makes holiday logistics with my in-laws a little more complicated than I'd like, involving a fair number of polite excuses about back pain and a preference for the pull-out couch downstairs. My husband, for his part, has never pushed the issue, and has never fully explained why he seems, if anything, relieved every time I make some excuse to avoid that particular room, which is its own a bit answer, I suppose, even if it's one neither of us has ever quite said out loud. Thanks for listening tonight, friends. If any of these stories kept you company a little longer than you meant to stay awake, that's exactly what they were for. Don't forget to come back for the next collection, and until then, check the closet, mind the 217, and try not to dream about the road